Continuing with Unit 1, Ancient Civilizations, we're going to talk about Ancient Greek style. There's a lot to the chronology as far as what's going on when. We're going to start in the Bronze Age again, contemporaneous with the Egyptian and the Mesopotamian culture, and then we're going to move forward through to the Greco-Roman period. I'll stop there because essentially Greek culture influences Roman culture quite a bit, and so we'll talk about it from the perspective of the dominant society, Roman. But we'll move through time, moving through the Bronze Age from the Minoan period to the Mycenaeans to the Dark Age of Greece, through the Archaic period, Classical period, and good old Alexander the Great. The Hellenistic period, it really does begin with Alexander the Great. It doesn't really end until well after the Romans have become the dominant society and conquered Greece. We're going to move forward and think about a little bit the difference in climate from the other two civilizations we've discussed. Greece is a very large peninsula, but it also includes a great deal of islands. These islands were separate during the Bronze Age. They were similar peoples, but those from the mainland moved to the island of Crete, and they built a very strong trading culture, which had peace and prosperity from 2900 BC to 1450 BC. The Minoans were named for the legendary king Minos, and this is the Palace of Minos at Knossos. That's with a K, K-N-O-S-S-O-S. They had quite a bit of material wealth and very little emphasis on tombs, unlike the Egyptians. This particular palace was built between 1600 and 1500, and it's agglomerative, which means it was grown piecemeal. So they built certain parts of the palace and then add to it over time. This means it was very easy to get lost in. It also didn't really require any fortification because the naval power of the Minoans was so strong. But it also had a specific kind of column, the Minoan column, that is tapered at the base and then widens at the top. These are usually colored. We think of them as red specifically because of the artifacts that we have left. But you can also see behind those columns is a bull relief that is painted. That is because bulls were the sacred animal of Crete, and therefore this is where the myth of the Minotaur comes from. So you have this large sprawling palace that has been that is hard to get around because it's been added to over time. Think about when people go into the Karen Hilly Phillips Center and they enter the front and they try to get upstairs to the back, how the two do not connect. That's a very small example of how difficult it must have been to get around this palace, and that's also why, nerd that I am, I joke about the fact that the Minotaur will eat you if you try and walk around KHP unattended. So the interiors of Minoan civilization had a high level of material comfort, specifically because they weren't putting all of their wealth into tombs as the Egyptians were specifically. They were well lighted, lots of windows. They had running water piped into their bathrooms of the upper classes. And they were peace-loving and secure, so they had brightly colored frescoes that generally had to do with nautical themes or people enjoying themselves in some lighthearted way. This is another example of sort of their colorful treatment, almost fantastical treatment of nature, and this carries on to the Mycenaeans as well. So this is what the Minoan civilization looked like. So this This map shows some of the other regions of Greece. These are different cities that were built by mainland Grecians, but essentially taken over by the Minoans, just by their trade influence, essentially. So here you can see how strong sort of they were in the region. At this time, there's two cultures. Essentially one of the mainland, which is called Helladic, and one of the island, which is called Cydatic. Both of essentially the island culture is the one that heavily influenced the mainland until the mainland asserts dominance. I also wanted to briefly show you an image of what the modern day Mediterranean looks like, so you can have a sense of how all of these places fit in. So currently we're talking about Crete, specifically here. This is modern day Turkey. This is also referred to as Asia Minor often. And so if I say Asia Minor at some point, that's because a lot of historical texts refer to Anatolia, which is specifically this part of Turkey. It's the coastal part that people go to relax in. It's quite beautiful. So what we've been talking about so far is, so the Fertile Crescent, Mesopotamia, is over here. The Nile runs through Cairo, it comes up through here. And these people were trading with all of the Mediterranean. There's evidence of their pottery and other traces basically all through Egypt and Sicily and Spain, all the way over here to Spain. So they were really just sailing around most of the Mediterranean Sea, extremely actively trading. They're even depicted in wall paintings in Egypt. And you can see here sort of the Egyptian style meeting with these Minoans. Later I'm going to talk a little bit about how Minoans are wearing sort of what we think of, it's a skirt, but kind of looks like athletic shorts, kind of. And it may have been gathered in the middle at certain points and times. And so you can see this sort of style versus the style of the Egyptians. Basically, there were both the Minoans and the Mycenaeans, who we're going to talk about next, had a two-class society. It was the upper class and the lower class, and a huge gulf in between the two. There was really no middle classes. Women occupied a higher place in society than most early cultures. We think that to some degree this is because the mother goddess was the main deity. You can see, this is one of my favorite paintings. You can see the woman in the middle. Look at me, I'm so great. The men, oh yes, you are. So like there was equality with men, at least we think there was. Women were often depicted engaging in public festivals, including one of the main sports, which was some form of bull jumping. So women and men would participate in these activities, and there's, of course, the bull being the sacred animal. This was not just something that was being cruel to the bull, it was a feat of athletics and celebration. Here's a general sort of drawing of one artist's interpretation of the clothing that people wore. The textiles, as we've been discussing, were linen and wool. There's lots of evidence of spinning, weaving, and dyeing. They were very brightly colored and elaborately patterned garments. The design motifs, so for instance, the wave fret and some of these early key, like Greek key patterns, would have been fairly easy to weave. There are some other patterns which might have been a little bit more complicated, but that's nothing that the advanced weavers in the society could not have done. There's evidence of chemicals specifically that were brought to fix dye colors to linen specifically, so we know they were dyeing their linen. Scholars differ on if the clothing was more tailored or draped, but it's widely believed that a lot of the clothing was developed from an early use of leather, which does require tailoring because of the stiffness of the material. So with men's clothing, they would wear a loincloth similar to athletic briefs. We think, like I said before, it's sort of a skirt with a point, but it may have been gathered in certain ways or sewn together into sort of shorts. But here we have images of that. It may have also, the crotch may have also been reinforced, specifically because with bull jumping you have to worry about lots of impact and potential horns coming your way, pointed towards your sensitive areas. There's many paintings that have these very long skirt points as well as aprons. Both men and women wore these little aprons over their skirts. So there's a tassel at the end. And there's also evidence of poncho-like capes, which makes sense. If there's a draft, you want to wrap a blanket around you. Poncho-like cape is an easy way to sort of have that encircle your body without having to hold it on or clasp it in some way. For women's clothing, there are 3 different kinds of skirts. The first was the bell-shaped skirt that we see. So these are deity votives. We don't think necessarily everyone was wearing this level of complexity, but this is the evidence we have for what they were wearing. So you can also see the apron here. You can see the tight-fitted bodice, but the bell-shaped skirt. This is a different deity. There is you can see it's a series of horizontal V-shaped ruffles, with each ruffle a wider circumference. So again, the bell shape, but it's expanding in increments in a specific way. This is a modern recreation of someone making this. It looks kind of like muslin, so that you can see sort of what a real version of this might look like. This is extremely tailored. You can see that there's obviously seams in the bodice, even the princess seams. So the third kind is disputed. It could be an overlapping edge of a wrapped skirt, but there's lots more images that get more convincing that perhaps this was a kind of early culotte. So this is what culottes are, for those of you who may not know what culottes are. They're essentially pants that are as flowing as a skirt, and so you can see that this leg hole and this leg hole are distinct, and sometimes the separation between legs doesn't go super high, so it kind of has a bit of a skirt feel while also being pants. So we think that that may have existed in this culture. Women wore bodices that, as I was discussing, are probably tailored. There's lots of decoration down where a seam might be, like over the top of the arm, or not. Their edges of garments were highly decorated. And breasts were exposed, so I'm about to show a slide that will have a real woman's breasts in it because it's a recreation of this, so just fair warning. So this slide has how tight-fitted it is around a high waist. This is a sort of modern interpretation of, therefore the fabrics are not anywhere close to being time period accurate. And the sleeve is exaggerated. It's a fashion runway interpretation, essentially, of Minoan dress. And moving to the next slide that has a better representation of sort of these aprons and how tight-fitted the sleeves were. Another version of how the bodices may have been. We think that maybe not all classes of women or ages of women exposed the breasts. I think that it was not in any way a taboo, but it may have been more priestesses serving the mother goddess that habitually had their chest exposed, but there is some speculation that ordinary women may have covered that area with some sheer fabric, but no one really knows. And once again, coming back to this image I've already shown you, here's their sort of interpretation of these culottes and what they may have looked like. As well as some simple tunics, loincloths, things like that, pointed. And of course, short skirts for the most part. What we do know, there are some instances, of course, of long skirts, particularly on women. What we do know is that it was a warm climate, and they did not wear much clothing. Here we have so eventually what ended up happening was a giant volcano went off in Santorini in nearby Crete, so right in the middle of not in the middle of the Mediterranean, but between Crete and mainland Greece. And this sort of shows the ash fallout from that explosion. This destroyed or damaged many cities on Crete, specifically because there was earthquakes, fire, ash, things like that, which is believed to have weakened the Minoan Empire to the point that it was easier for the Mycenaeans to gather their military and conquer Crete. When that happened, we enter the Mycenaean period, which happens at around 1450 BCE. And the Mycenaeans are thought to be a little bit more primitive and warlike than the Minoans were. They had migrated from Asia Minor, the Turkey region, the Anatolia region. And the city of Mycenae had actually been built by the mainland Greeks. So Mycenae is over here, had been built by the mainland Greeks, and they conquered it. So here's the more warlike conquerors of the Mycenaeans, and here is the city that they conquered. Once they conquered it, they began a series of large-scale engineering projects, and one of those projects was to build walls around most of their cities for protection. These walls astounded later Greeks, who believed that the giants must have built these walls. They were so huge to them. Here is the entrance to Mycenae. This is the Lion Gate. It was erected during the 13th century BC. In the northwest side of the Acropolis, and is named after the relief sculpture of two lionesses in a heraldic pose, which stands above the entrance. The Lion Gate is the sole surviving monumental piece of the Mycenaean sculpture, as well as the largest sculpture in prehistoric Aegean. It is the only monument of the Bronze Age Greece to bear an iconographic motif that survived without being buried underground, and the only relief image which was inscribed in the literature of classical antiquity, such that it is well known to modern archaeology. So this picture in particular doesn't really give you a sense of how big this is. It's not quite as big as what we were looking at in Egypt, but here's people in relation to that Lion Gate. The other thing that's unique about this is up until now we've been talking about post and lintel construction. And instead of it just simply being post and lintel, it now has what's called a corbelled arch. So the corbel arch is constructed by offsetting different courses of stone so that they project towards the archway's center from each supporting side until the courses meet at the apex. So it's the beginning of us starting to, as humans, bolt bolt things in architecture. So meaning to be able to not just have a flat roof, but a arched roof in some way. Here's some arches that we're going to be exploring through time. Here's post and lintel. This is triangular. And this here is corbelled, so you can see that the tensile stresses are pushed sort of from one side to the other, using this the offsetting of these stones. We're not all the way here to the Roman arch yet, but we're getting close. The Mycenaean civilization is made of more than 300 towns. Each with a palace, with each king made a monument to his power and glory. So essentially each town had its own king, and they spent a lot of time and energy on engineering projects that were really essentially about that specific city-state and its power. If we look at the Mycenaean map, we see these different towns. Now, don't forget, there's about 300 of such city-states, but this is where their control essentially was contained. So a lot of these towns, specifically Pylos and Mycenae, we have evidence of the kind of building they were doing at the time. They were all decorated with frescoes of artistic and technical quality. You can see, again, they're using this same style of Minoan column. This is a recreation, but using the same sort of motifs. It's not a drastically different culture. Also, these are what the shields look like. They're like essentially two circles, one on top of each other, made of animal skin. Well, wood and animal skin and bronze and all kinds of other things. But we still have this beautiful fresco work. Here's another example of sort of, again, this sort of style of abstracted reality or nature. Grave sites were filled with gold and silver, which reflect an extremely wealthy civilization. Here's a series of jewelry that was found. Ring. This diadem. And death masks. So this is Agamemnon's death mask. So the Agamemnon of Greek literature and plays. This wealth continued until a mysterious sea people ruined trade with piracy and destroyed many of the walls the Mycenaeans had built. So this reaving went on for quite a while. It affected many civilizations in the Mediterranean, including the Egyptians. This is from a famous scene on the north wall of the Medinet Habu, which is used to illustrate the Egyptian campaign against the Sea Peoples in what had become known as the Battle of the Delta. While the hieroglyphics did not name Egypt's enemies, describing them simply as from the northern countries, early scholars know that they have similarities between hairstyles and accessories worn by the combatants of other reliefs in which such groups are named. So essentially, we don't really necessarily know who these people were. We think they were potentially other Greek tribes or other peoples in the Mediterranean. But the result meant that Mycenae and the Mycenaeans were completely decimated, and they ended up surviving, keeping on going for another 100 years or so. But then when the Doric invaders came from the north, Mycenae itself was destroyed, but Athens survived. And after this period, we move into what's known as the Greek Dark Ages, between 1200 and 750 BC. The Minoan civilization completely disappeared. There were no written records during this dark period, but epic ballads were sung by wandering bards and woven into a cycle like Homeric poems in the Iliad and the Odyssey. So at this point, we are going to take a break in the lecture. Please consult the rest of the lesson and complete any Ed puzzles that exist there.